Hello, John.
Hi, George. How are you?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. How's your summer?
Well, I don't know. It seems endless, but not necessarily in a good way.
Oh, not like that old surfing flick, Endless Summer, where they go around the world and find the best waves.
No, it's not endless bliss. It's I don't know. It's something else. I'm
Endless
actually.
tedium.
Pardon me?
Tedium.
Well, I think I'm a little gloomy right now because of something that just happened.
What?
So Susie has been gone for the last week. She's out in Denver at a publishing workshop in which all these people are coming up with strategies for making this memoir that she wrote about taking care of wild birds, wild success. So it's this really cool thing. She's got about 100 students in this class who are all coming up with marketing strategies for her book and then presenting it to her. They flew her out and put her up in a hotel. So it's this kind of fairy tale publishing experience that she's having. That's quite unfamiliar.
Why don't we ever have those?
That's right. Nor I. But so I'm responsible for taking care of the bird she has. So right now she has 5 crows down from 9 crows and a whole bunch of other birds that she had just a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And so I've been going out every morning and giving them dog kibble that's been soaked in water and defrosted mice and other little delicacies. And
you keep a carton of mice frozen in the kitchen?
We have a whole freezer out in our garage that's just filled with dead animals for Susie's birds. She actually just got a big styrofoam box in the mail from some company that ships out frozen rats and mice to...
Oh, so you don't have to catch them yourself.
No, but we do that also, and a lot of people around town capture mice, or they sit out mouse traps, and then every now and then they come over with a little goodie bag for Susie and her birds. But anyway, what happened this morning? So I also changed the water for the birds and just make sure they're okay. And one of the crows was dead.
Oh no!
Which is really bumming me out, and it's gonna be. Susie just. Her heart breaks when she loses a bird, and I know she's going to be really upset. And then I'm also worried because the West Nile virus has been killing not the birds in large numbers, but it's been killing some crows. So Susie is in touch with wildlife pathologists in New York State, and they've been reporting isolated cases of birds dying. So I'm worried that it might be that, but
God, I hope not.
Who knows what it is? So, and also,
any other clues as to what might have been the cause?
I put it in a bag and put it in the freezer, and Susie will check it out, and then she might send it to one of these pathologists when she gets back. So that's what she normally does to see if it's West Nile.
Yeah, sure.
Or something else. So anyway.
Yeah, wow, I'm sorry to hear that.
But even before this happened, I was going over the list of stories and looking for science stories over the last week and sort of coming up with some Science Times and The Economist and other places. And and I was kind of getting this feeling, I'm sure you go through this, that there's nothing new under the sun. All the science stories just seem recycled.
Yeah. Well, we've got to try to snap you out of your funk.
Okay, good. Well, you always do that for me, George.
Yes, if I may try, I think I have just the thing to do it.
Oh, good.
It's called a Large Hadron Rap.
I saw that.
Did you see that?
Yes, it's very silly in a good way.
Yeah. It's to back up. It's the Large Hadron Collider is, of course, the huge particle accelerator atom smasher that's apparently it's possible within the next couple of weeks it's going to finally go online for its first dry run. Not to really do new physics, but just to start ramping it up and seeing if it works, with the thought that in a few months they'll be finally doing these experiments that may reveal more about the ultimate constituents of the universe.
Yeah.
But it turns out that someone at LHC, a woman named Kate McAlpine, who's described as a science writer who works at CERN, which is the organization that's running the collider, posted this rap video on YouTube about the LHC and the discoveries it's going to make. Let me see if I can just capture some of the soundtrack by playing it on my computer.
Uh-oh. Running more than one program at the same time.
Yeah, Bob says not to do this. Can you hear it? Is that coming through in your end?
Actually, it's not.
Okay, well, I think it's being picked up by my recording, and it's showing all these physicists with their hard hats down into the tunnel doing this, some kind of hip-hop dancing.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let me just read some of the lyrics here. Well, I'll keep playing the soundtrack just in case it's coming through. But we'll give people the link to look at it. But my favorite verse says, "They think about dimensions. We live in just 3, but maybe there are others that are too small to see. It's into these dimensions that gravity extends, which makes it seem weaker here on our end. And these dimensions are rolled up, curled up so tight that they don't affect you in your day-to-day life. But if you were as tiny as a graviton, you could enter these dimensions and go wandering on." What do you think?
That's pretty good. You know something? I actually did check that out this morning, and I was amazed at how informative it was.
Yeah, it was the most informative rap video or rap song probably ever.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe
unless you want to learn about, obscurities of LA gang culture.
Yeah. Well, whatever it takes to grab people's attention these days. I think one of the most popular items that Scientific American has published on its website lately is, I think it's like a 3 or 4 or 5 minute video that's titled something like "String Theory for Dummies."
Yeah.
And it's just become wildly popular. So I bet this Large Hadron rap will be the same.
Yeah, well, it's good anyway, so people at least have some sense of, what they'll be looking for and why this is sort of exciting.
Yeah, other than having to worry about mini black holes produced by the collider that suck the Earth into it.
Right. Yeah, I guess people are still worried about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a cheap way of grabbing people's attention.
I'm not gonna worry about that.
No, I'm not either.
Yeah, I think we thoroughly dissected that issue in the past. So
what else is there? I mean, what is? Let me just ask. I hate to put you on the spot, but what is the last genuinely novel scientific discovery that you can think of?
Genuinely novel?
Yeah.
Oh boy, I am on the spot. Well, the first thing that comes to mind are some of these unexpected mechanisms in DNA encoding and decoding.
Yeah.
That kind of went against the standard dogma of RNA makes DNA makes protein, and showing that there's some kind of weird regulatory loops that kind of break out of the mainstream there. Just showing again nature doesn't follow dogmas. They call that the standard dogma, but just exploits every little niche that it can to get something done.
Yeah, so the problem I have with those, those are interesting.
You call those
just
kind
those
of
before.
Details, though.
They're difficult to explain. I guess I'm thinking of something that is really simple to explain, and you immediately get the reaction of, "Wow, that's
okay."
amazing."
Like J.J. Thomson and Robert Millikan establishing the existence of the electron. So you go from electricity's possibly just some kind of weird charged fluid of something to saying that it's made of these particles called electrons.
Yeah, so there were these clusters of discoveries like that about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
The most recent one that I was just sort of trying to think of this morning, and I thought of two that have happened since I've been a science writer. The first was high temperature superconductors.
Yeah.
Which was, I think, either late 86 or early 87.
Yeah,
right
it was late
around there.
80s. It was after I got to the Times, and it was written by James Gleick.
That's right, and
The
Jerry
first story,
Bishop.
he described it as Woodstock, right?
Yeah, so that
Like
was
the
the
meetings,
big.
the
There was a big
solid-state
conference.
meeting.
Well, so just to explain, previously at extremely low temperatures, down near absolute zero, just a few degrees Kelvin, you have this phenomenon called superconductivity, where electricity passes through a substance with absolutely no resistance at all. It's really this kind of magical property, but generally you have to cool things down to 6, 7, 10 degrees Kelvin. But then these two solid-state physicists at a lab in Switzerland discovered this kind of crumbly ceramic material that superconducted at about, I think it was 100 or 120 degrees Kelvin, so it's still pretty cold, but it was a huge advance, totally out of the blue, compared to what was possible previously. So it created this tremendous excitement. Both
They called it room temperature superconductivity, or that was the Grail, the Holy Grail. Although this was still way cold, right?
Yeah, they still haven't gotten to room temperature.
No, it's like they were going from liquid helium to liquid nitrogen temperature.
Yeah, and so the possible applications were tremendous, and all the theorists, Phil Anderson, the Nobel laureate, got really interested in trying to explain this. So that was really wonderful and new. The biggest thing, and I think this is actually bigger because it's sort of a cosmic discovery since then, was the expansion of the acceleration.
Acceleration. Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Of the universe.
Uh-huh.
So that was almost 10 years ago, and nobody expected that. I guess we had this sort of, in spite of relativity, this kind of Newtonian view of the universe as having this initial burst of energy that led to the expansion, and then our conventional physics would just tell us that, of course, the expansion would decline over time as gravity sort of gradually worked it against the expansion. And then I guess there are a couple of groups that were studying supernovas, which give you a measure of the distance of the universe and of the rate of expansion, that discovered that far from decelerating, there's an acceleration to the universe.
Right.
And this led to lots more interest in so-called dark energy models of the universe, and the possibility that there is this mysterious energy that's pushing things outward, and that might have played a role in the Big Bang. And nobody's really explained that. A total amazing surprise.
Yeah.
But other than that, other than those two things, I'm hard pressed to think of.
Mapping of the human genome, but that was just kind of a matter of time.
Yeah, that was just kind of a grueling, inevitable process. That wasn't really a discovery.
Yeah.
That was really startling and unexpected along the lines of these other things.
I'm going to find one.
Pardon me?
I'm going to find one here. Let's see. I'm actually scrolling through Time Magazine's top 10 of 2007. Hot Jupiters discovered. This October, British scientists identified 3 new planets outside our solar... Oh, the new planets, the extrasolar planets.
Yeah, new planets.
Or actually the extrasolar wobbling stars that are interpreted as planets.
Yeah, I was writing about new planets in the late 80s at Scientific American, George. There are a lot more of them now, but...
yeah, so you mean like just in the last few years?
Yeah, and I mean
year or so.
Really unexpected, not something that's kind of the inevitable result.
So number 7, a big bird-like dinosaur is out.
big bird-like dinosaur.
I'm not even going to read that.
I remember Discover had a cover, God, it must have been 10 or 15 years ago, this thing that looked like a malevolent ostrich that supposedly roamed Antarctica. It was kind of a dinosaur-like giant bird that would tear things to shreds.
Yeah. Did you know they found the world's oldest animal in 2007?
Really?
Yeah, from Bangor, scientists at Bangor University in Wales. It was a clam, the Arctica atlantica.
A clam?
Known to survive some 200 to 300 years. When it first lodged itself down in the sand, Shakespeare's Hamlet was on stage at the Globe Theatre, and the English were setting up camp in North America.
Wait a minute, a clam that is how old?
Oh, 200-300 years old. I guess they... Yeah, oh no, here it is. They dated it exactly somehow. 405-year-old clam found in the ocean shelf off the coast of Wales.
So what did they do with it? Put it in some hot water and serve it up with cocktail sauce?
I knew that would cheer you up.
A clam.
Yeah, so no, I take your point. I got that question a lot when I was doing my book tour for the 10 Most Beautiful Experiments. The question of today, is it possible that we could have a beautiful experiment that was the way that I defined it and portrayed them in the book as being these moments when with some very, very simple apparatus, a scientist poses a question to nature and receives a crisp, unambiguous reply, and just for a moment knows something that nobody else knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think so. I mean, I doubt it, but obviously you can't never say impossible.
Yeah,
Cold fusion seemed exactly like that, and of course it wasn't. But
right. I mean, there could be something like, some of these old pseudoscience stories could suddenly generate some really hard evidence, like ESP would be an obvious one. But, these things have been kicking around for so long. There have been so many opportunities for people to...
But as technology improves, it's not going to be a simple experiment, but as they can measure the strength of gravity and how it varies on tinier and tinier, like sub-millimeter distances, if they find that it, suddenly lapses into inverse cube law instead of inverse square law, then, it's not exactly like... the world's going to, stop and gasp in awe, but that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right, though. It's technology that sort of gets the gee whiz reaction from us now. Even something like, I hate to say it, but, the iPod, those sorts of things are, if you go back 20 years and present somebody with something like an iPod, their eyes would really pop out.
It's funny, I was just thinking about that yesterday because among the items stolen in my burglary were my cell phone, which is no big deal because I only use it when I travel. But I just got a new cell phone, and then I was thinking how when I was in the 6th grade, my brother and I for Christmas got walkie-talkies.
Right.
It came from Lafayette Radio and Electronics, and they were these like big, almost the size you see in World War II films, these walkie-talkies, and you'd hold them up to your ear, and it seems like it was about a foot long, and you listened and talked, and it broadcast on the Citizens band frequencies.
Yeah.
And my best friend George Livingston, his parents got him a walkie-talkie too, so on Christmas Day we were wandering around the neighborhood just marveling that we could talk to each other without wires connecting. It would go for like about a block and then it would fade out.
We got...
when you think about cell phones.
We got walkie-talkies for my son just about 4 or 5 years ago. In fact, we were sort of cleaning up the house recently, and I found these things. And I remember when we got them for Mac, he was about 9 or 10 years old, and he was thrilled. And we'd take these car trips, and what the boys really like to do is you'd have 2 cars, and one set of boys would have one walkie-talkie in one car, and they could talk to the boys in the other. And now, of course, they all have cell phones.
Now they text, yeah.
Right, and so the eye of it, walkie-talkie is like horse and buggy technology.
Yeah,
and
right.
It was, just this thing is just 5 years old, and it was really pretty cool then.
Yeah.
I also had a deja vu reaction just looking at Science Times this week. So there were a couple of stories. One really obvious one. There was a really funny story on this inventor who has been obsessed with creating a workable jetpack.
Oh, yeah. And there was even a video of the reporter, John Schwartz, strapping on the jetpack and soaring through space.
Right. But it was hilarious because he said at one point, I guess this thing, it's got a really powerful motor in it. I think it works
jet engine.
By forcing air out of these gigantic fans. And he said at one
it's like
point,
a turbine.
Pardon me?
I think it's like a jet turbine.
Yeah,
and it spins really fast and sucks in air and propels you along. And
although the inventor said that technically it's not a jet, and I forget exactly why that is, but he said it sounded more like almost like a gigantic leaf blower. And in fact, that's what the reporter said. But he said they were sort of moving along this guy's property, and suddenly they went too close to a tree, and it sucked a tree branch
that's right.
into one of the air input vents, and it completely screwed it up, and they had to shut it down and
rebuild.
Start
and it was like soaring inches above the surface of the lawn.
Right. So it seems like we still have a ways to go.
A water slide, a slip and slide would have been more exciting.
Right. Anyway, so we've got a ways to go before the jetpack.
So that's not so good.
There was another story about that was very reminiscent to me. Malaysian shrews get drunk by eating these fermented plants.
Yeah, and presumably they're drunk all the time. They don't decide to. They probably don't have a concept that you have to wait till 5 o'clock.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And the question was, what was the, so the scientists were trying to figure out why the shrews would want to do this. Whereas, I don't know, I think you and I we both have a beer now and then. We would just say it feels good to get a little stoned on alcohol.
Yeah,
but that reminded me, I'm going to hold up this book now. For my last book, Rational Mysticism, I got into the science of drugs, and there was a book that came out in 1989 by a guy named Ronald Siegel, who's a psychopharmacologist at UCLA. He has been called the Leif Erikson of psychopharmacology, and this book, he says that. He calls intoxication the fourth drive after sex, hunger, and thirst. He says that not only humans, but animals throughout the animal kingdom have this urge to get stoned. And he offers, it's a really wonderful book because it's chock full of all these anecdotes about animals that are eating or drinking various things to get stoned. So, for example, in Africa, there are boars who dig up the roots of this plant called iboga, which has the drug ibogaine, which is a really powerful hallucinogenic.
Oh, yeah.
And the boars dig it up.
Hunter S. Thompson used that in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, I think.
Yeah, it's become quite trendy now. Supposedly it has anti-addictive properties, so maybe you become addicted to iboga, but it helps you get over your alcoholism or whatever. But the boars eat this stuff, and then they kind of stagger around. There have been lots of reports of deer and chipmunks eating fly agaric. That's the mushroom with the big red cap, the little white spots on it.
Right.
Which is extremely toxic.
Yeah, that's one of the ones you have to avoid when you're mushroom hunting.
Yeah, there are some people who say that it's a really interesting high, but if you have a little bit too much, you drop dead. But apparently some deer and chipmunks like it.
Really?
Siegel has this whole chapter in which he talks about robins and other birds getting high on holly berries. And some of them eat so many of the berries that they become really intoxicated and they drop dead.
Wow. Well, with the shrews, I mean, if they're constantly imbibing alcohol, you'd think they'd have a problem with fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yeah, well, it's...
So maybe this is why they didn't evolve the way we did.
Well, it might... Well, I thought aren't we supposed to be descended from tiny shrew-like mammals that were sort of skittering around through the feet of dinosaurs?
Skittering around beneath the feet of the dinosaurs.
Right.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
But,
yeah.
So this was enough...
This all kind of, it just raises the question of what the drinking age should be for shrews. And I just say that as a segue into this piece in Slate, which appeared this week, that actually was following up on a nice essay that Don McNeil wrote in the Sunday Week in Review a few weeks ago about Spain's going to grant rights to the great apes, to chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. I read that Slate piece this morning, and it linked to a story in Time magazine about what's going on in Spain, and the Time story sort of harped on the contradiction between this enlightened attitude towards chimpanzees and gorillas and other primates, and Spain's attitude toward bulls.
Towards what?
Bulls.
Bulls. Oh, right, bullfighting, of course.
Right.
Well, yeah, maybe attitudes also toward northern African immigrants.
Right. Good point, George. Yeah, what do you think?
I mean, that was kind of Don's take on it, was that, there aren't absolute rights in society. You're allowed, children have fewer rights than adults in certain cultures. Different ethnic groups have their rights circumscribed. We subscribe the rights of animals, and it's interesting. I mean, obviously they're not going to let the chimps vote.
Right.
Yeah, and they're not even going to release them from zoos, but they have to, as far as experimentation and putting them, deliberately in pain or discomfort for the supposed advances of science, they'd be more limited than that, right?
Well, and it even said that they couldn't be used in circuses or in advertising or be dragged onto TV shows to provide comic relief.
Yeah. Well, they should... Well, maybe they get royalties. If they have rights, they're going to need to have some responsibilities too, and maybe earning a paycheck should be one of them.
I think you're right that maybe this could cut in two directions. This actually reminded me of a story that broke about 5 years ago. I forget if I've mentioned it on Blogging Heads. Remind me if I have. But it involves a male chimpanzee that was the leader of a troop that Jane Goodall has been following in Tanzania for a long time. It was this big, tough male named Frodo. And Frodo is the star of this movie that Goodall made about the chimpanzees on her reservation. And as I said, she's written about him a lot. There were some stories about him being really nasty, not only to other chimpanzees, but to humans. So Gary Larson, the cartoonist, he apparently got the hell beaten out of him by Frodo when he visited
really?
Jane Goodall's reservation. But here's where it gets kind of serious. I think this was about 5 years ago. I'll try to find a link and post it. There was the wife of one of the rangers on the chimpanzee reservation was doing something, gathering sticks or engaged in some chore, and she had her a baby on her back, and Frodo runs up to her, snatches the child off this woman's back, and then runs up a tree with the child and eats it.
Oh.
And
Wow.
this caused a big scandal, and
I must have read that at the time, but I don't remember it.
it didn't get a lot of. Jane Goodall has such a wonderful reputation that a lot of places didn't know. I think a lot of publications decided to let it pass because they didn't want to make her look bad. But she actually, there's a policy in Tanzania: if an animal kills a human, it has to be put down.
Yeah.
Jane Goodall appealed to the president of Tanzania. And I found out this because Susie has a good friend who works at an orphanage in Tanzania. And she said that Goodall appealed to the president to allow Frodo to live. And so Frodo, in this case, had more rights, or was given more freedom than a human would
got away with murder.
He literally got away with murder.
Yeah, of course, if they had decided to do what they would usually do and take him down, then this would have been done without a trial and a jury of his peers.
Well, that's true.
There may be some important link that they're missing between, deep cognitive abilities and rights. But I guess part of the argument for the Spanish, I guess they haven't done this yet, but strongly considering granting rights to chimpanzees is because they can recognize themselves in the mirror and supposedly have these very crude language skills.
Well, that's true of So
where do you draw the line?
Right? One of the things that bothered me about this story is that there's so much sort of human narcissism in it. Of course, we grant rights to these animals who are most like us.
You have to be biped.
Right. So I obviously have a very high opinion of the intelligence of parrots and crows and animals like that.
Right.
Who I think are, and there are some biologists who think are every bit as smart as the higher primates.
Yeah.
But I guess they're not used. The problem with chimpanzees and monkeys and gibbons is that they're really used a lot in medical experimentation because they are so similar to us.
Well, yeah, and that's really was the point. Was it's like kind of finding a way to, put more regulation and control on that.
Yeah, I'm not a hardcore opponent of animal research. I guess I'd want to see evidence that research with, say, chimpanzees or rhesus monkeys has really contributed in a significant way to medicine, let's say, or to an understanding of how the brain works. Or, I was in a laboratory at Caltech a few years ago when I was doing this article on the neural code, how the brain processes information. Most of the information, really detailed neural information about how the brain works, comes from experiments with monkeys. And it was shocking to me because most scientists hide this. I walked into this lab. This is a guy named Richard Anderson. And he had all these monkeys strapped in chairs with holes. Actually, some of them had the tops of their heads had been sawed off, and they had wires coming out of their brains, and that made me squeamish, to say the least.
Yeah.
But my feeling is that there are really important findings coming out of this research. Anderson assured me, and I believed him, that the animals aren't in pain. They do everything they can to reduce their suffering.
Right.
But I think that's still what the debate should focus on, is whether, yes, the animals are, it's certainly not an ideal life for them, but if we are learning things that are really important for science and medicine, then I think it can be worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I mean that's just always kind of the scientific party line doctrine that I've certainly ascribed to as a science writer without really thinking about it thinking about it very much. I guess I was given pause by the famous case of the little rabbits who were blinded to do important research into mascara or something by some pharmaceutical company, some cosmetic company.
Right.
I mean, that seems different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or if it's just feeding human vanity, I'm sure it's hard to draw this line, but I think it's pretty
science,
easy.
But yeah, it's going to be, in a case like that, it wouldn't be so hard to draw, but obviously there's going to be gray areas.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see. I'm glad for Peter Singer, the now Australian-born, now Princeton philosopher. I think this is really a triumph of his...
Right, the chimpanzee rights thing.
Yeah, long effort to try to get people to recognize animal rights and animal suffering.
Yeah. I started thinking more about this issue when I was writing my chapter on Ivan Pavlov and with the salivating dogs, and this was also in 10 Most Beautiful Experiments, and some of the reviewers really gave me a hard time for saying, how could you call that a beautiful experiment when, I never really knew until I read a bunch of Pavlov's papers and some books about him, how he did the experiments. This was with the bells, and the dogs salivate to the sound of the bells, although it turns out he didn't actually use bells, so that's actually kind of one of those memes that keeps replicating. He used all kinds of things. He taught them to salivate at ascending musical scales, but not at descending ones. Mm-hmm. That's the one that really, really amazed me.
That is amazing.
Yeah, and to salivate, at certain time intervals, but to collect the saliva, since he was using this as a proxy for the strength of the connection they made in their brains, like how strong the association was by how many drops of spittle would come out. And he wasn't just waiting for them to drool out the sides of his mouth, but he did this surgery where he did an incision in the bottom of their mouth, and he would have a collecting tube coming out of the salivary glands. Ah. So, that sounds pretty...
Did he use... Do you know if he used anesthesia or if he took
any... He did. In fact, maybe these were Pavlov apologists, but people said that he was probably one of the most skilled and gentle surgeons in Europe, and that his laboratories in St. Petersburg probably had sanitary conditions that were better than most hospitals. Mm. So I thought that was interesting, and also I thought the thing that I really loved was that he named his dogs.
Yeah.
And they took them out for runs on the grounds of the Institute, and when he was, one of his later birthdays, his students got together and put together an album with pictures of all of his various dogs with their names. And
I think
so. He wasn't this evil man who was exploiting, these poor dogs for his own gain. I mean, it was gains in knowledge, and he was inflicting as little pain and discomfort as he could, and they had pretty good lives for being surgically altered.
Yeah. It's there's so many ways
Pavlov that I want to try to find here.
There's so many ways you can come at this debate. I'm sure I've mentioned before. Susie, my wife, doesn't even think that parrots should be kept as pets.
Right.
Because the reason they make such good pets is because they crave social interaction. If they can't have it with other birds, then they enjoy it with humans. But even the best human owner can't approximate what it's like for one of these parrots being in a gigantic, chattering flock of 40 or 50 other birds out in the rainforest.
Yeah.
And it's so the two parrots that we have as good a life as you can get because Susie takes such good care of them and interacts with them constantly and gets the rest of us to do so.
Yeah.
But it's still a very thin.
Yeah, because we don't know what's going on in there in the little craniums.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll show some pictures here of Pavlov's dogs, just that I have this out.
Uh-oh, double program again, George.
Yeah, no, I'm actually using the same camera. I only have one now. Let's see, I'm trying to get I guess it's staying in focus. Okay, there they are, Pavlov's dogs. So, yeah.
Well, so what else? Let's see.
I made some notes here. Let's see.
What about, should we give Chris Anderson some more free publicity?
Oh, this is Chris Anderson, the editor of Wired.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
he wrote this book, which we came up with this idea, or popularized it, I guess, of the long tail. Should we talk about that?
Yeah. Why you feel like doing the heavy lifting and explaining what the long tail is?
Yeah, let me see if I can. The basic idea is, if you take a bell curve, or half of a bell curve, with all of the stuff up at the top, the fat top part of the bell being, representing people's mainstream kind of interest, like say movies or something, and all the big blockbuster hits that most people who watch movies all flock to the theaters or the video stores or Netflix to see. And then it kind of tails off where there's all these really obscure little films, but the idea was that the long tail is basically infinitely long, and with the internet and modern computer communications technology, it becomes feasible to have just the most obscure small titles available, and to develop these little, more of these little subculture, sub-audiences that can, that just have a certain kind of, obscure genre of film or director that they like to follow, and that maybe there's enough that the director can actually get an audience, way down at the end of the long tail, but still consisting of thousands of people, and make some money. I guess it's basically the narrow casting philosophy on which Blogging Heads is based.
Yeah.
The idea of getting these little, putting together these little miniature audiences on the fly, and yet, since you're able to reach the audiences and get them to connect with each other, you might be able to make some money that way.
Right.
But then there's been some counter arguments. I guess the first one I saw was a few weeks ago in Slate, where someone was arguing that actually when you look at the numbers, it's still the big blockbusters that are getting all the attention. But that doesn't seem to contradict, to me, what Anderson was saying. He never said that there wasn't going to still be popular culture, but that there was going to be a more fertile medium for unpopular culture and subculture.
Yeah, it seemed to me that Slate piece kind of ended up throwing up its hands about whether Anderson was right, or whether this critic was right, that the long tail is insignificant, because it all depends on how you define the tail and how you define the big lump in the middle.
Yeah, because one of the arguments against the long tail was that, what was it? They looked at Netflix or Amazon or something, and they found that, or iTunes, I think, and that there was some small number of titles that got a huge number of downloads, and then there was a huge number of titles that got like maybe 100 downloads total all year.
Yeah.
But how does that refute it? That's just what he was saying.
Right.
So ours made his portion of the $9.99 for each 10 titles. So enough to go out to dinner on 100.
Do you think this has really made a difference in our business and book publishing?
I wonder that. Yeah, it has in a way that not in any way that's enriched me, but my very first book about conspiracy theories was called Architects of Fear, and that was published in the mid '80s, and came out in hardcover. They never sold the paperback rights. It was well reviewed, but not widely reviewed. I got some minor book awards for it, like the Los Angeles Penn Center Award for something or other. And then it basically disappeared from the face of the earth. They had, I think the first printing was just a few thousand copies, and the publisher ended up pulverizing the remaining printings after I got I think 50 copies to stick in the garage.
Mm-hmm.
And the book pretty much disappeared from the face of the earth, although it had a cult following. Mm-hmm. I would get emails from people who were looking for a copy, and people would find it at the library. And a lot of times the people, who were looking for the book were kind of not the audience I had in mind, since I was kind of doing this, what I thought of as a rational debunking of conspiracy theories. But in so doing, I gave lots of really interesting information on the Illuminati.
And so you just fed some of these conspiracy cultists.
Yeah, but now the book is pretty easily available. Like when online book selling first started, a few copies would show up, and it was selling. I guess it still sells for more than it sold for when it first came out in like 1984.
Oh, that's a good sign.
Yeah, so
it's desirable.
I've seen minty copies of it online for sale for like $50. So.
Mm-hmm.
And it's made it available, though, so now anyone who wants to buy a copy, which might be, 5 or 6 people every year, can go to Alibris or Abe's Books or something like that, Abe Books, and find it for, about the price of a hardcover today.
So it's not making you, it's not significant financially, but it's out there still percolating.
Yeah.
In a sort of intellectual way. It's still infecting people's minds and getting responses
it
out
matters
of it.
less now when books go out of print.
Yeah. That seems to me to be the main benefit. That's a benefit also just of email, so people can get your book and then also get in touch with you.
Yeah.
And have a correspondence with you. Sometimes you might not want the correspondence.
No, but it's still pretty cool.
Yeah, sometimes
it's not. But, it's really great hearing from a reader who liked one of your books or who has an intelligent quibble. And
yeah, well, there was an article in The Economist related to this, and actually the Economist article related to the long tail.
Yeah.
And the Economist article was about a scientific paper in the peer-reviewed journal Science on the long tail phenomenon in scientific papers. The way that the long tail should work in principle in science is that as more and more scientific papers go online in journals and so forth, that scientists can find more and more previous references to a particular piece of research. So it should just broaden knowledge generally, and it gives an opportunity for scientists at obscure research institutions or maybe in third world countries for their work to come to the attention of more prominent research, and all this sort of democratic phenomenon emerging from the availability of papers online. Mm-hmm. So there's this guy who decided to test this hypothesis to see whether the long tail was working in scientific publishing, and he found that it wasn't at all. So this is a guy named James Evans, who's a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and in his paper in Science, he found that as more journals have become available online, fewer articles are being cited in the reference lists of the research papers published within them. Moreover, those articles that do get a mention tend to have been recently published themselves. Far from growing longer, the long tail is being docked. So I think,
I don't know.
This makes a kind of intuitive sense to me in that, there's just so much information available.
Yeah, and you could also argue that, it seems like his argument's assuming that, all of the science, including the stuff, way out in the hinterlands under the, the very, nether regions of the tail is going to be equally good.
Well,
compared to what's coming out of Stanford and Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and that's not the case. I mean, it could be that, that could happen, but in general, the best scientists are identified and end up concentrating in the best places.
Well, so are you saying that a typical researcher will be checking out papers from some of these more obscure groups and then deciding that they're no good, or just they decide in advance that it's not worth looking at them?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what I mean, but I guess a separate parallel mechanism is that scientists are competing for grant money and appointments and tenure at the best schools that they can get to. So you'd naturally expect the best science to be coming out of the best schools, and therefore those are going to be the most well-known papers, and they're going to be the most well-cited. But there may be quite a bit of overlap between those and what actually indeed are the best, most important papers.
Yeah,
And the same with going back in time. The idea of science is you're doing new stuff, and naturally someone's not going to be too interested in seeing if somebody uncovered something really interesting back in 1926 at some obscure college in Transylvania, and that it just never found its niche, and the meme never got propagated, and suddenly they're going to unearth it maybe and find something really cool that we didn't know about vampires.
Well, doesn't this sort of agree with your own experience of, sort of in the last 15 or 20 years or so, as Google has made basically an infinite amount of information available to you at an instant, that one reaction to that is to, instead of trying to be cognizant of that, to go in the other direction and to look at fewer and fewer potential sources of information for you to react to, because it's just too overwhelming.
Ah, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So it's actually like, as more and more becomes available, you have to aggressively make your filters tighter and tighter.
Right. So it's
getting overwhelmed, and you may overcorrect in the wrong direction and end up being exposed to fewer things.
Right. Well, so
I guess I don't think that's quite happening, because it really is striking how you can, just be reading something for some reason on the internet, maybe related to an article you're writing, and then you click a link, and then you just kind of go down the rabbit hole for the next 2 hours and come up with all kinds of stuff. With people talk about the old serendipity of going to the library to look for a book, and then you would pass by something else accidentally in the aisle that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. But that happens constantly.
Well, that's still kind of a keyword directed serendipity, as opposed to, actually, the article in The Economist makes the point that in the old days, when you had hard copies of journals, you'd open it up, and this is what I used to do at Scientific American. We had scores of these different journals, and I would try to spend one day a month or so flipping through them. So remember, you had the old astrophysical journal? The goddamn thing would be about 2 inches thick, and I just really skim it rapidly. I give maybe 45 seconds to each one, and you're kind of flipping through and just looking at the abstracts, looking for names and institutions, and in that way you might stumble on things that you wouldn't notice if you're doing a keyword-directed search through Google or on one of these big scientific databases. So that's another possibility. I'm not too worried about it. I just think there's just too much stuff out there, and we learn what we need to know, and or we don't.
Yeah.
And, big deal if we don't.
Yeah, I'm not going to worry about it too much.
This article has a great kicker. It says that it's not yet clear whether this change is for good or ill, meaning this sort of narrowing of the focus of scientists, or at least their references. Electronic searching means no relevant paper is likely to go unread, but narrowing the definition of relevance risks reducing the cross-fertilization of ideas that sometimes lead to big, unexpected advances.
Yeah.
As a wag once put it, an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less until eventually he knows everything about
nothing.
Which is a great description for modern particle physics, actually.
Yeah. I don't know. It just seems to me that when you have this fire hose of information blasting at you, even if you do have to filter more and more, you're still probably getting exposed to more novel stuff that you wouldn't have known about otherwise.
Oh, I am definitely not one of these fuddy-duddies who thinks that our children are all being ruined because they're not reading books anymore.
Yeah.
There were just some articles on where was the article on this?
Oh, yeah.
In the New Yorker or the Times or something. I think it was
The
an op-ed
Times,
piece
actually,
in
I think.
yeah, deploring how kids don't read books anymore. They're on the internet, they're reading and they're writing, but a lot of it is text
they're
messaging.
reading in little chunks, yeah, and they're not writing structured sentences.
And I think that's fine. I mean, I think it's different. It's not bad. It's just different. They're evolving.
Yeah.
It's going to be like that Isaac Asimov story in which all the children evolve into some kind of super beings and their parents really can't understand them, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah, that's what we did, right?
Yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, I don't know, and I think there's still plenty of young people reading books.
Yeah.
I don't know the statistics, but I don't know. It worries me sometimes, but you're probably right that it's just different. But yeah, just on the internet, you're just reading these little chunks of information, then quickly flitting over to something else. But one counter argument is that you have to learn to be more critical.
Mm-hmm.
Because so many people assume just because you read something in a book that it has to be true, because otherwise no one would have gone to all the trouble and expense of putting it in a book and exposing themselves to ridicule by writing something that was false. And a lot of people use that as a basic kind of operating procedure, when they're evaluating information, the old school. And, now with the internet, you realize that anything there has a good chance of, being junk or fraudulent, and you really have to think about it. Plus, you can very easily, quickly, without, leaving your desk, get lots of different conflicting viewpoints on a subject.
I think the internet also teaches kids to be very skeptical too. So both of my kids are they love coming up with wacky videos. They find all this stuff on YouTube or elsewhere that's just strange. So they have very finely tuned sensibility to just random weird stuff, and they can recognize a phony video. So they've shown me some stuff. I remember there was something involving a jumping whale or a jumping shark. It was a video that went viral actually a couple of years ago, and it was bizarre. And my son showed it to me, and I was dumbfounded. I thought it was amazing. And he's looking at me, kind of smiling, and he goes, Dad, don't worry, it's not real. And so it's not like they don't have this ability to discriminate. In fact, in some ways, they're more discriminating than we are because they're living in this world so much, and they have to make they have to tell what's real.
Yeah, I think that's all for the good. Although, don't you think there's something to the argument about shorter attention spans or the diminished ability to put together a structured, rational, long-term, not long-term, but many-part argument, or to construct an argument in prose, with sentences that can not only be understandable but persuasive to the reader, and I wonder if that's going by the wayside slowly. Instead of having some great article in the New Yorker that somebody spends weeks or months on and puts together this piece of literary art that informs you and takes you along in this great story, you just get people blogging off the top of their heads and just, typing the first thing that, flickers across their mind, so there's no deliberation or is that just
I guess
totally reactionary?
I'd have to be. I guess the question is, it's the end of civilization, George. I mean, the question, there's got to be sort of a law of conservation of bullshit. So at any time in the history of culture, 99.999% of what's produced is bullshit, whether it's long or short or, opinion or supposedly factual. And I would think that doesn't really change. Whether you're talking about blogs or
so it's still the same
19th century
percentage
novels.
that it's 99% of a much larger mass.
Yeah. And so, quality will still be recognized as quality, whether it's a quality blog or a quality feature article or a textbook. Anyway.
Boy, that was pretty inspiring.
That's my curious. So I started off gloomy, and now I choose to be optimistic.
One way or the other, I think this internet thing's here to stay.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, I always thought going to the library was a pain in the neck. I never could.
You're kidding.
I never
that's
really.
always been one of my favorite things.
Well, when I found something, it always felt like an amazing accomplishment, especially if I used one of those giant index books for magazines, and you found some 30-year-old magazine article, but it was just so much work.
Yeah, but you really did feel like, wow. The same. It's like it elicited all these old hunter-gatherer, primitive feelings in the ancient brain.
Yeah, now any fool can do world-class research.
Yeah, that's kind of true. Although, any fool with a discriminating sensibility, but there's very few people who can take that stuff and put it together into a coherent narrative.
Yeah.
There's where they may still keep us around in cages.
Or if that doesn't work, we can still keep appearing here on Blogging Heads TV for people with slightly shorter visual-oriented attention spans.
Yeah, well, 1 hour attention span's pretty good.
Oh, actually, that's true.
No commercials.
Yeah, actually, that's very long
that's
compared to the
some
typical
smart
YouTube
people
video.
In the forums.
Yeah. Hey, 1 hour and 1 minute.
Hey, that sounds like time to wrap up and to go surfing.
We did it again.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, John, I hope it's not West Nile, and I'm really sorry about it's always a shock losing a pet.
Thanks, George. Well, this is just it's a wild animal, not a pet.
Well, but losing an animal that you knew.
Yeah, Susie's going to take this hard.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks, George. I appreciate it. And I guess I'll be talking to you going up to Nantucket. Might even see Bob Wright.
Hey, maybe you and Bob can do one on front, like a beach scene or something.
No, I don't want to do anything that requires any intellectual effort at all.
A real vacation.
And talking to Bob genuinely does require some intellectual effort.
You have to be on your toes.
Yeah, so I just want to hang out on the beach, drink cocktails, play in the surf with my kids.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I'll talk to you
later in the summer.
Yeah. All right.
Okay,
Talk to you
John.
soon, George.